She lived alone in the mountains, with only memories and silence to keep her company. One chilly autumn morning, she found a dirty old sack rustling in the forest. Inside, 4 tiny golden puppies, cold, starving, and left to die. She saved them without a second thought. But what no one knew is how those pups would one day save her, in a way that would bring the entire town to tears. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched in solemn majesty, their slopes draped in the quiet decay of late autumn. Trees stood half naked, their last leaves trembling in the wind like forgotten prayers. The forest exhaled a damp chill that whispered through the hollows, laced with the earthy perfume of moss, pine needles, and wood smoke. Tucked into a clearing between 2 ridges stood a small wooden cabin, its roof sagging under time, but its chimney stubbornly breathing life into the air above. This was the home of Edeline Wren, 78 years old, and for the last 15 years, alone. She was a tall woman once, though age had softened her spine and slowed her gait. Her silver-white hair, thick and long, was usually bound in a loose braid that hung over one shoulder like a thread of moonlight. Her hands, though veined and gnarled, moved with purpose, the hands of someone who had chopped her own firewood, canned her own tomatoes, and turned the same doorknob 1,000 times. Her eyes, a cloudy storm gray, still held the gentle patience of a woman who had loved deeply and mourned quietly. Edeline had lived in this cabin with her husband Charles until the accident, the kind of senseless wilderness tragedy that left more silence than answers. He'd gone hunting before first snow and never returned. When they found him, it was too late. She buried him beneath the great oak just beyond the porch, the one that still stretched its ancient limbs like an old friend protecting the house. She often sat under it, whispering to the wind, telling Charles about her day, about the garden, about how lonely the nights had become. Despite the solitude, Edeline had not become bitter. She still spoke to the birds, still left a saucer of milk on the porch for passing strays, still believed that kindness was never wasted, even if no one saw it. Every Sunday, she wrote a letter to her daughter, Clara, who had moved to Chicago after college and hadn't returned in over 5 years. The letters, carefully written in a flowing script, were always gentle, never accusatory, and ended with the same line: "I hope you're warm. I hope you're happy. I still love you." She never stopped sending them, even though the last reply had come years ago. That night, before the world changed, Edeline dreamt of a dog. It came to her not as a creature she knew, but as a shadow, barking in the mist, racing through trees, calling to her in urgent, echoing cries. The forest in her dream was dense and strange. The barking was not aggressive, but pleading, as if the animal were trying to lead her somewhere. She woke just before dawn, heart hammering against her ribs, her breath fogging the air in the bedroom. Outside, the wind rustled dry leaves, but there were no barks, only the stillness of a waiting day. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Something stirred in her, not fear, but the weight of an unspoken calling. So, she dressed, layered her woolen shawl over her faded sweater, pulled on thick socks and worn boots, and took the walking stick Charles had carved her from cedar on their 15th anniversary. The house seemed to watch her quietly as she stepped outside, the door creaking shut behind her. The forest path was overgrown in places but still familiar. She hadn't walked this far from the cabin in years. Her knees protested with every step, but something stronger than discomfort pulled her forward. It wasn't adventure she sought. It was understanding. A message hidden in a dream rarely comes without a reason. Golden light slanted through the trees as the morning rose higher. Edeline walked past the blackberry bushes where deer sometimes gathered, beyond the stones she and Charles used to sit on, into deeper woods where the air grew damper and colder. She followed the trail until it disappeared and then trusted her instincts, winding down toward the river that cut through the forest like a silver scar. The trees thinned and the sound of water grew louder, and then she heard it, a soft, stuttering whimper. She stopped. The sound came again, faint but unmistakably alive. Edeline turned her head, eyes scanning the shoreline. Just beyond the bend, caught between the roots of an old willow tree, something pale jutted out from the rocks, half hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves. It was an old canvas sack, worn, stained, with fraying seams, the kind used to carry potatoes or firewood, and it moved. Another whimper. Edeline's breath caught. Her heart began to beat harder, not from fear, but something far older, an ancient protective ache that welled up from the center of her chest. She stepped slowly toward the sack, boots crunching damp gravel, the river murmuring beside her like a witness holding its tongue. And then the sound came again, clearer this time, a high, thin yelp. Something or someone was inside. Edeline crouched beside the sack, the river's cold breath brushing her cheeks as she reached out with careful fingers. The canvas was wet, heavy, and smelled of rot and mildew. Her hands trembled as she loosened the coarse knot at its mouth. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, 4 tiny trembling bodies shifted inside. A chorus of soft whimpers rose into the chilly morning air, fragile and hoarse like the last gasps of a dying fire. Her breath hitched. They were puppies, golden retriever pups, no more than 4 weeks old, barely larger than loaves of bread. Their fur was matted with mud, their bellies hollow from hunger. One lay still, its ribs faintly rising and falling. Another tried to lift its head, a single eye half open, clouded with fatigue. Their ears twitched as she whispered gently, "It's all right, little ones. I've got you now." She wrapped them in her wool shawl, pressing them close to her chest. Their warmth was faint, but real. She cradled the bundle as though it contained embers she couldn't let go out. The climb back to the cabin was slow. The path seemed longer than before, her legs weaker, her arms heavier, but never once did she shift the pups away from her body. The smallest of them whimpered every few minutes, a soft, aching sound that pushed her forward more effectively than any sense of duty. By the time she reached her porch, the sky had grown pale with noon light, and her back throbbed from the strain. Inside, she lit the fireplace with hands she hadn't realized were numb, then laid the puppies in a basket lined with rags and blankets she kept for mending. She moved with urgent tenderness, warming milk on the stove, filling an old syringe dropper, and coaxing each mouth open in turn. 2 fed greedily, 1 required gentle prodding, and the smallest, its eyes barely open, refused at first, until Edeline pressed it to her chest for warmth, whispering lullabies she hadn't sung since Clara was an infant. When they were fed, she cleaned them with warm cloths, murmuring soothing nonsense and names as they blinked sleepily up at her. She named the quiet one Ash, for his ashy-colored paws and silent demeanor. The bolder pup who kept trying to escape the basket became Maple, golden and wild. The most timid, always curling beneath the others, was Fern. And the one with a small tear on its hind leg, who growled softly even in his tiny size, she called Bramble. Each name felt like a promise, a tether tying them to the earth, to safety. The afternoon passed in a haze of warmth and careful motion. Edeline barely noticed the passage of time. Her cabin, so often steeped in silence, now hummed with the soft sounds of life. Snuffling noses, sleepy sighs, the occasional sharp yip when Maple tumbled too far from the group. But that night, as she was checking Bramble's leg again, she noticed the wound wasn't just a scrape from the rocks or a thorn. It looked jagged, circular, like a bite. Her breath caught. It wasn't large. Whatever had bitten the pup had been small, maybe another animal. But the angle and depth were strange, deliberate. A chill settled over her. Who would leave 4 puppies in a sack beside a river? Not a careless owner. This was intentional. Abandonment was one thing. But this bordered on cruelty. Sleep didn't come easily that night. She sat by the fire long after the pups had curled into each other, their bellies full and their breathing steady. She watched the flames, her thoughts heavy. The image of the bite haunted her. By morning, the wound had grown red around the edges. Bramble whimpered when she touched it. Infection. She had to get him help. And for that, she had to go somewhere she hadn't dared in years, the town below. It was a 20-mile drive to Brook Hollow, the nearest town with a vet. Edeline hadn't driven that far since before Charles died. Her truck, a faded blue 1997 Chevy, had been lovingly maintained, but rarely moved beyond the mountain trail. That morning, she packed Bramble into a crate lined with blankets, left a note taped to the front door in case someone came by, though no one ever did, and began the slow descent. The road was winding, narrow, and half-eaten by time. Frost still clung to the shaded turns, and the brakes moaned in protest on every curve. But Edeline drove with a steady grip, her eyes flicking from the road to the crate beside her, where Bramble lay breathing shallowly. She arrived in Brook Hollow just before noon. The town hadn't changed much. Same red brick shops, same faded awnings, same old diner with its sign hanging crooked. She drove straight to the vet clinic, a small white building with a green cross painted above the door. The parking lot was empty except for a Forest Service vehicle, mud-spattered, with a tan and green decal on the side. As she stepped out of the truck, holding Bramble close in a towel, the clinic door opened, and a young man stepped out. He was tall, lean, early 30s at most, with sun-browned skin and shaggy chestnut hair tucked beneath a forest ranger cap. His eyes were an unusual color, hazel with specks of green and sharp with curiosity. He wore the standard ranger uniform, scuffed boots, and a radio clipped to his belt. He paused when he saw her, then offered a warm, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said. "Need help?" Edeline adjusted the bundle in her arms. "I found a pup. He's hurt. I think it might be infected." The man stepped closer, his eyes flicking to the puppy. "Golden retriever?" He squinted. "Wait, 4 weeks old? I just heard something about... Well, let's get him inside first." Inside the clinic, the vet, an older woman named Dr. Whitby, short, practical, with square glasses and a no-nonsense tone, immediately took Bramble and began cleaning the wound. "It's a bite," she muttered. "Likely another dog. Infection setting in, but we caught it early." Edeline stood quietly, watching, until the ranger spoke again. "I'm Eli Harper," he said, extending a hand. "Forest Patrol. I heard from a hiker last week that there were strange sounds near the southern river bend, whimpers. I was going to check it today." "I found him there," Edeline said, "and 3 more, in a sack." Eli's jaw tensed. "That's not natural. Someone's been up there, and not for anything good." She nodded. There was something in the way Eli looked at the puppy, the concern in his brow, that made her trust him instinctively. They talked briefly while Bramble was tended to. Eli asked questions. What day, what time, what the sack looked like. His voice was calm, but edged with tension, like a wire stretched too tight. He took notes, promised to check the area, and gave her his card. "Call me if anything strange happens," he said. "Even if it's nothing. Better safe than sorry." As Edeline carried Bramble back to the truck, now resting, stitched and wrapped, she glanced at the ranger again. Young, yes, but not green. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of Charles in his younger days, watchful, steady, full of quiet questions. Back on the mountain that evening, Edeline fed the other pups, checked their bellies, kissed their noses. Bramble was sleepy, but better. The fire crackled, the room felt full again. But as she sat on her rocking chair, the card Eli gave her tucked into the pocket of her sweater, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. Someone had been there, someone who meant harm. And for the first time in years, the silence of the mountain didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. The first real snow came early that year. By late November, the Blue Ridge Mountains had dressed themselves in white, softening the jagged paths and quieting even the bird song. Edeline Wren's cabin, now dotted with footprints of 4 small golden lives, pulsed with warmth and a new kind of rhythm, no longer dictated by silence, but by feeding schedules, little howls, and sleepy sighs curled up beside the hearth. In the early hours, Edeline would wake before the sun, sometimes not from habit but from instinct, the quiet whimper of Fern, who disliked the dark, or the muffled rustling of Maple, who refused to stay in the blanket nest. She moved through her days with a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years, though her joints ached and her hands stiffened more often now in the cold. The puppies were growing quickly. Ash remained her shadow, watching her every move with thoughtful eyes. Maple was the mischief maker, bounding clumsily into baskets and overturning her neatly stacked knitting yarn. Fern liked to hide beneath the cupboard and peek out, wide-eyed and uncertain. And Bramble had healed well. His leg, once red and swollen, now carried him with stubborn pride. He was the first to bark, the last to sleep, and had taken to guarding the porch as if he owned it. Edeline found herself talking more, out loud, not just in her thoughts. She told stories as she fed them, her voice soft, like water running over stones. The pups would watch her, heads tilted, as if they understood the weight behind her words. Charles was never patient, she'd chuckle, pouring goat's milk into 4 tiny bowls. He once tried to build a chicken coop without reading the instructions. We ended up with something that looked like a haunted outhouse and 3 very angry hens. She didn't plan to tell the stories, they came on their own. The memories, long buried beneath solitude and routine, began to rise like spring water after a thaw. She spoke of the early years, how she met Charles at a community dance in Asheville, how he'd brought her mountain daisies instead of roses, how they built the cabin plank by plank with their bare hands. And she spoke of the later years too, quiet winters, whispered promises, and the day he didn't come back. The dogs didn't flinch when she cried. Ash would climb into her lap. Fern would nuzzle her knee. It was enough. One afternoon, as she worked in the garden behind the cabin, loosening the frozen soil around her dormant herb beds, Edeline felt a sudden sharp pain in her hip. It was so swift, so unexpected, that her legs gave out from under her. She fell sideways into the dirt, gasping as her shoulder struck the corner of a wooden crate. The pain was blinding for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to rise but couldn't. Snow was beginning to fall again. The sky above spun slightly, and her hands trembled as she tried to shift her weight. "Not now," she whispered. "Please, not like this." From somewhere near the porch, a bark split the air. It was sharp, urgent. Maple. The little pup stood at the edge of the steps, eyes locked on her, tail stiff. Then, without hesitation, he turned and darted into the trees. Edeline, groaning, called weakly after him, "No, come back!" But Maple didn't pause. The world blurred. The cold crept under her coat. And then, a strange peace settled over her, as if the mountain itself was folding her gently into its arms. She closed her eyes and thought of Charles. It was nearly 30 minutes later when she heard branches crackling and boots against frost. A voice, low, steady, familiar. "Mrs. Wren!" And then he was there. Eli Harper, the young forest ranger, emerged through the tree line, his coat dusted with snow, his green-flecked eyes wide with concern. He dropped to his knees beside her without a word, checked her breathing, then eased her upright with strong, practiced hands. "Maple came right to my patrol truck," he said, breathless, ran out of the woods barking his head off like the forest was on fire. "I followed him straight here." Edeline laughed, despite the pain. It came out ragged and disbelieving. "That pup, I thought he'd gone to chase squirrels." Eli smiled softly as he helped her into the house. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing." Inside, he stoked the fire, warmed a towel, and brought her tea while she rested on the couch. His movements were quiet, respectful, never overbearing. When she thanked him, he simply shrugged. "Forrest knows how to raise the right dogs," he said. That evening, while the wind howled and the snow thickened outside, Eli stayed a while longer. They sat together, she in her rocker, he on the hearthstone, his hands loosely clasped, the pups, now calm, curled in their usual heap beside the fire. Eli looked around the cabin, at the patchwork curtains, the bookshelves, the mason jars filled with dried herbs and saved buttons. "You've built a world up here," he said. Edeline nodded. "It kept me going. After Charles, after Clara stopped writing." He tilted his head. "Clara? My daughter." Her voice cracked on the word. "We had a falling out. Nothing dramatic, just one of those cracks that widens over time. She lives in Chicago, or did." Eli didn't press. He simply said, "Maybe she'll write again." "I still send letters," Edeline admitted, "every Sunday. I don't know if she reads them." There was silence between them, but not an uncomfortable one, the kind of quiet that exists only when someone is truly listening. Before leaving, Eli offered to come by again the next week. "I've got a spare tarp," he said. "Your roof's got a soft spot. I'll patch it up before it becomes a real problem." Edeline nodded. That would be kind, and he did. Over the next several days, Eli returned with tools, canned food, and a half-laughing excuse about getting to know the mountain better. Sometimes he stayed for tea. Sometimes he left dog biscuits on the porch. The pups came to know him, barking joyfully at his scent. Even Fern, the shyest of the four, would nudge his boot with her nose. One morning, Edeline found a small package on her doorstep. Inside was a new pen, wrapped in brown paper, and a note, "In case you feel like writing something new." Her hands trembled as she held it. For the first time in many years, Edeline Wren didn't feel like the last leaf on a withered branch. She felt, quietly, stubbornly, like spring might come again. The storm came down the mountain like a slow-moving beast, its breath thick with mist and thunder. By nightfall, the wind clawed at the windows of Edeline's cabin, and the trees bent and whispered warnings only old souls could understand. The fire inside crackled steadily, casting flickering light across the wooden floor where 4 golden pups huddled together, their eyes wide and ears twitching with each rumble of thunder. Edeline sat in her rocking chair, a quilt draped over her legs and a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands. The dogs had sensed the change in the weather before she had. Bramble paced near the door earlier that afternoon, his stance protective. Maple barked at the sky. Now, though, they were silent, watching the shadows on the walls as if the storm might seep through the cracks. It was near midnight when she drifted off, her head nodding gently as rain lashed the roof. But she didn't stay asleep for long. Ash, always the calmest, rarely barked. But tonight, he let out a single sharp woof that cut through the wind like an arrow, then another. Then he was nudging her arm, pawing at her shawl with surprising insistence. She stirred, blinking. "What is it, love?" Ash trotted toward the front door, then turned and looked back at her. Something wasn't right. Edeline stood slowly, joints protesting, and shuffled toward the entrance. The wind pushed hard against the door when she opened it, and cold rain slapped her face. The lantern on the porch swung wildly, casting wild arcs of light. And there, in the mist, stood a figure, soaked, shivering. One hand pressed to her side, the other reaching out toward the light. A woman. Younger than Edeline, but not young. Perhaps in her late 30s, her features barely visible beneath a tangled curtain of wet, dark blonde hair. She was tall, narrow-shouldered, with a posture half collapsed from exhaustion. Her clothes, jeans, a rain-soaked jacket, hiking boots caked in mud, clung to her like second skin. And even before she stepped fully into the light, even before she opened her lips, Edeline knew. "Clara," she whispered. The woman's lips trembled. "Mama," she breathed. I didn't know if you were still here. I crashed. My car, somewhere past the bend. Then I heard barking. I followed them." Edeline didn't wait. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her in close. Clara clung to her like a branch in a flood. Her body shook not just from the cold, but from something deeper, the kind of shaking that comes from breaking too long and too quietly. Inside, the cabin welcomed her like a memory made real. The pups swarmed her feet, tails wagging, sniffing with curiosity. Ash remained at her side, as if proud of the role he had played. Edeline helped Clara out of her wet coat, sat her near the fire, wrapped her in a dry blanket, and placed a mug of warm tea in her hands without a word. Clara looked around the cabin, at the mismatched curtains, the hand-carved shelves, the faded photograph of Charles still sitting above the mantel. "It's all the same," she said softly. "Even smells the same, smoke and pine and rosemary." Edeline sat across from her. The years between them stretched taut, an invisible thread that trembled with every breath. But Edeline didn't ask why it had taken so long. She only said, "You're home." Clara stared into the flames for a while, then she spoke. "I left because I didn't want to become like you," she said. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was tired, honest. So afraid of losing something that I never let anything close. After Dad died, I couldn't handle your silence, the way you walked through the house like a ghost. Edeline nodded slowly. "And I was afraid if I held you too tightly, you'd break." "I know," Clara said, "and I broke anyway." There was a long pause. Outside, the storm softened into a steady drizzle. The dogs settled near Clara's feet, their presence warm and grounding. "I wasn't going to come back," Clara admitted, "but then I got sick." Edeline's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Clara set down the tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the sleeve of her sweater higher, revealing a hospital bracelet she hadn't removed. "Stage 4, she said quietly. "Lung, and no, I never smoked. Life's funny like that." Edeline didn't speak. "I have a few months, maybe. I didn't come to be forgiven, Mama. I wanted to see you again. One last time." Edeline crossed the room in silence and knelt before her daughter. Her hands, worn from years of work and sorrow, cupped Clara's face gently. "You came back," she whispered. "That's all I ever needed." They sat like that for a long while, Two women wrapped in the warmth of forgiveness and the cold truth of time. The pups curled close around them, sensing something sacred had happened, something that couldn't be named. Eventually, Edeline helped Clara to the small guest bed in the loft, unused for years, but still made with care. She brought up an extra quilt, the thickest one she owned, and a hot water bottle wrapped in wool. Before Clara drifted off to sleep, she looked at her mother and smiled weakly. "Those puppies. They saved me. I would have died out there if I hadn't heard them. I followed their barking like it was music." Edeline brushed damp hair from her daughter's brow. "Then they were meant to find you." Downstairs, Ash lay beside the front door, ever watchful. Maple was stretched belly up near the hearth. Bramble snored softly, and Fern curled into Edeline's slipper like it was a nest. As the storm passed and moonlight began to break through the mist, Edeline stood at the window, watching the forest breathe again. Her daughter was asleep. Her home was full. And though sorrow still waited in the shadows, for the first time in many years, Edeline Wren felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Hope. The storm was long gone now, leaving behind clean air, soaked soil, and a quiet more profound than usual. Mornings on the mountain became slow rituals of light and warmth, sunbeams cutting through misty pines, coffee simmering on the stove, and the soft patter of golden paws across wooden floors. For the first time in many years, the cabin on Blue Ridge Mountain did not feel like a shelter for one woman's grief. It felt like a home. Clara settled into the rhythm of mountain life more quickly than either she or her mother had expected. Her body, still weakened from treatment, moved with deliberate slowness, but she rarely complained. She wore long knit sweaters and soft hats to shield her from the morning chill. Her once sleek city posture now relaxed into something gentler. Her smile came easier. She laughed more, even when it brought on a cough. There were days her color improved, days her strength returned in bursts, carrying a basket of chopped wood, helping Edeline stir the soup, brushing knots from Maple's ever-tangled fur. The puppies had taken to her with fierce loyalty. Bramble, usually the aloof sentinel, slept beneath her bed. Ash was never far from her side, especially when she read aloud from the old books Edeline had tucked away over the years. Fern would paw at her hand gently during coughing fits, and Maple, still a reckless sprite, often dropped leaves into her lap, as if presenting little forest treasures. For Edeline, the presence of her daughter brought about a quiet bloom. She moved with renewed steadiness, her face less drawn, her eyes bright with the colors of memory and forgiveness. They spent long afternoons knitting together on the porch, speaking of nothing and everything. Clara told stories about Chicago, some true, some exaggerated for laughter. She admitted she'd once considered moving to California, taking a job at a vineyard. Edeline spoke of Charles, of their early years on the mountain, of Clara's first words spoken beside the old oak tree in the front yard. One evening, as the dogs played beneath the fading sun, Edeline and Clara sat watching the light change on the hills. "You named them after plants," Clara said, smiling as Bramble tackled Maple in a flurry of fur and joy. "I named them after things that survive the cold," Edeline replied, "the kinds of things that come back in spring." That night, Edeline found a small sketch tucked into one of her old journals, drawn in Clara's hand. It was of the 4 dogs curled around the base of the oak tree, their eyes closed, their bodies peaceful. Beneath it, Clara had written, "They forgave us first." Outside their bubble of peace, the world had not stopped. Eli Harper visited more often, now not just as a ranger, but as something closer to kin. He brought bags of dog food, a toolkit to fix the porch railing, and once a bouquet of wildflowers that he left quietly in a jar on the windowsill. He was careful not to intrude, always asking permission, always offering help instead of assuming it. His presence brought a steady, grounding energy. Eli was in his early 30s, lean and long-limbed, with a quiet strength and the kind of face that held both curiosity and care. His forest ranger uniform often bore signs of wear, mud on the knees, a small tear near the collar, but he wore it with the ease of someone who knew the woods better than most people know themselves. He spoke rarely of his past, but once, during a lunch of soup and cornbread, he mentioned that he had been raised by his grandfather after losing his parents in a house fire when he was 8. Since then, he'd lived with a deep sense of debt to the land and a mistrust of anything that smelled like cruelty. It was during one of his patrols that Eli stumbled across something that set his instincts ablaze. About 5 miles south of Edeline's cabin, near an abandoned hunting trail, he found a cluster of metal cages, half buried in brush, rusted, but not yet consumed by time. One still held a length of broken chain. Nearby, he discovered fresh boot prints and what looked like discarded kibble packaging. His stomach turned. He returned the next day with a colleague, Ranger Dana Liu, a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a dry wit. Together they found more evidence: tire tracks leading to a secluded area, plastic bowls, and even a leather collar marked with crude numbers instead of a name. "I think we found your answer," Eli told Edeline 2 days later. He stood on her porch, cap in hand, voice low. "I don't think those pups ended up in that sack by accident. I think they were rejects." "Rejects?" Clara echoed from the rocking chair, a blanket around her knees. Eli nodded grimly. "There's a network. Backyard breeders, illegal stuff. They breed for money, for looks. If a pup's too sick, weak, or doesn't look perfect, they dispose of them. Usually worse. Sometimes they just dump them." Edeline's hands clenched around the teacup. The dogs, as if sensing the tension, drew closer. "I filed a report with the regional office," Eli continued. "We'll need more before we can press charges, but I'll keep looking." Clara watched him with a furrowed brow. How can people do that to something so defenseless? Eli looked at the pups curled around Clara's feet. "Because some people forget that life means something. These little ones remind me otherwise." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in a shawl, and stepped out onto the porch. The stars were impossibly bright above the ridge, the kind of clarity only found in deep country. She looked out at the dark silhouettes of the trees and listened, to crickets, to distant owls, to the heartbeat of the mountain. Ash came beside her and leaned gently against her leg. "I didn't deserve them," she said softly, "or her, but they love us anyway." Behind her, a light flicked on in the kitchen. Edeline's shadow moved slowly across the window, and in that moment, Clara realized that what had broken between them wasn't trust, it was time. And now, by some miracle of bark and fur and forgiveness, they were beginning to stitch it back together. The winter deepened, and with it came a tension that Edeline couldn't quite explain. The trees stood bare now, their branches like black veins clawing at a silver sky. Snow dusted the ground in soft layers, muffling footsteps and muting the once joyful sounds of birds and wind. The cabin, once full of warmth and laughter, now hummed with an undercurrent of something unsaid, something waiting. Eli had been gone longer than usual. At first, it was just an extra day. Then 2. He'd told them he was following up on a lead, something about the direction the tire tracks had taken, toward a stretch of land deeper than most dared to patrol alone. A place called Wolf Hollow, a dense thicket of pine and sharp rock, once used for illegal hunting camps and now mostly abandoned. He promised to keep radio contact. But on the 3rd day, the calls stopped. That morning, Edeline stood by the fire, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Clara sat beside the window, her thin frame wrapped in layers of wool, her eyes fixed on the forest beyond the glass. The dogs sensed the unease. Ash refused to nap. Maple barked at every breeze. Fern wouldn't leave Clara's lap. But Bramble was different. He stood at the front door, ears alert, tail still. He hadn't moved from that spot for an hour. Just watched the woods, as if waiting for a sound only he could hear. "He knows something," Clara said, gently petting Fern's head. "He's been pacing since last night." Edeline looked down at Bramble, whose golden coat shimmered with health now, muscles firm beneath thick fur, eyes sharp and intelligent. "I don't like this," she murmured. "If something happened to Eli—" "He'll come back," Clara said softly, though the tremble in her voice betrayed the doubt. But Bramble wouldn't wait. Just before noon, he let out a low growl, then a single bark. He nudged the door with his nose, turned to Edeline, and barked again. Urgent. Sharp. "He wants us to follow," Edeline whispered. Clara stood slowly. "You can't go out there alone, Mama. Not in this cold. Let me—" Edeline shook her head. "You're not strong enough yet." "Then we wait." But Bramble had already turned toward the trees, paws breaking through the snow, his path deliberate. Edeline watched him disappear into the white, heart pounding. In the forest beyond, Eli Harper lay curled beneath the twisted roots of a fallen pine. His leg was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, soaked red. His radio, now useless, had cracked when he slipped during the chase. The pain radiated from his thigh in hot pulses, and he'd been drifting in and out of consciousness since nightfall. It had all happened so fast. The man he'd been tracking, a wiry, sun-leathered figure named Reed Mallory, known in backwoods rumor as Dog Man, had been smart, if careless. A breeder-turned-smuggler, Mallory had once operated a string of illegal kennels across 3 counties, pulling in profits by selling sickly pups to online buyers who never asked questions. When the heat came down, he vanished into the forest with whatever stock he could carry, and left the rest to die. Eli had followed the trail for days. He'd found a burned-out van, several traps, and the smell of blood in the snow when he finally saw Mallory, grizzled, hollow-eyed, with a limp and a rusted shotgun slung over his shoulder. The chase began. Eli radioed in coordinates, but the signal cut. He chased Mallory up a ridge slick with ice. A loose stone, a wrong step, and Eli went tumbling through snow and rock. His legs snapped under him like dry pine. Now he lay there, lips cracked, eyes fluttering. Mallory was gone. The cold bit deeper with every hour. But then, through the trees, footsteps. Not heavy boots, paws, bramble. He appeared from the mist like a flame in the fog, nose low to the ground, eyes scanning, ears up. When he reached Eli, he paused only for a second, then began licking his face, whining softly. Eli stirred, groaned, tried to speak. "You clever boy," he rasped. Bramble darted forward, then back, trying to guide him. But Eli couldn't stand. Bramble barked once, then did something astonishing. He pressed his nose against Eli's chest, nudging him until Eli's good arm wrapped around the dog's neck. Inch by inch, Bramble helped him slide forward, dragging his weight with small, determined steps. Not far, just enough to shift position. Eli coughed, his breath misting in front of him. And then Bramble turned, sniffing the air, and he ran. But not away from the ridge. He was following a scent, the scent of memory. Bramble ran until he reached a trailhead choked with vines, one long buried by snow and time. It led toward an overgrown path, barely visible, curving along the ridge, a forgotten trail Charles Wren had once walked, the one he'd vanished on 15 years earlier. The trail opened into a crevice between stone outcroppings, where wind no longer reached and snow barely touched. It curved downward into a narrow canyon, protected by natural walls, leading, unseen by most, back toward the lower edge of the mountain, back toward home. And Bramble remembered it, because Edeline had taken them walking there, weeks ago, just once, for a quiet afternoon stroll, and the scent still lingered. Pine, smoke, rosemary, and something softer. Belonging. He reached the edge of the canyon, barked 3 times, then turned back toward Eli and ran again. It took him 20 minutes, but when he returned, Eli stirred. He followed again, slowly, painfully, step by step. When Eli finally stumbled through the mouth of the canyon and collapsed onto the snow-packed path near Edeline's garden gate, it was dusk. Bramble howled, a long, triumphant sound that echoed across the ridge. Edeline came running, coat flung over her shoulders. Clara followed behind, breathless, her eyes wide. Eli lay there, bruised and half frozen, but smiling. "You've got a hell of a dog," he murmured. Edeline knelt, tears already streaming. "We have 4, she said, but this one just became a legend." Clara touched his hand gently. "You're safe now. Come inside." And as they carried Eli back to the fire, Bramble sat tall in the doorway, chest puffed, tail wagging. Later that night, after Clara helped change Eli's bandage and Edeline prepared a broth, the ranger spoke again, his voice hoarse. "That trail, the one Bramble led me through. I think it's the old hunting path, the one your husband used to talk about." Edeline froze. Charles? She hadn't walked it since the day they found his rifle, just beyond the ridge. She thought the trail was sealed by rockfall, lost to time. But now, found again, by a dog with a name like Thorn and a heart like Flame. By the time the first golden leaves of autumn began to fall across the ridge, Reed Mallory had been found, arrested, and brought down the mountain in handcuffs. He hadn't gone quietly. He'd been hiding deep in Wolf Hollow, surviving on jerky and bitterness. but a team led by Eli tracked him down. Mallory's camp, once a pit of neglect and cruelty, was dismantled within days. The surviving dogs were rescued, treated, and rehomed through shelters that had long waited for justice. His name, once a whisper in the woods, would be remembered now for what it truly was, a shadow banished by the light. Eli Harper, though hailed for his role in bringing the man to justice, refused any ceremony. He accepted a commendation from the Forestry Service with quiet nods, and then returned to the cabin not for applause, but for something more lasting: belonging. He didn't go back to town. Instead, with a modest grant and some help from locals who admired his work, Eli began building a small house just a few hundred yards from Adeline's property. It was simple: pine frame, tin roof, wide porch. But it looked out over the same valley Charles had once called his favorite view. Eli's hands, though still scarred from the chase in the fall, moved with patience and skill. Bramble often lay near his boots as he worked, tail thumping in the snow, eyes alert. When Eli sawed planks or hammered nails, Ash would sit on the hill and watch, solemn as a sentinel. The dogs knew he wasn't just visiting anymore. Inside Adeline's cabin, life took on a slower, sweeter pace. Clara's illness had returned more sharply as summer faded. Her strength waned quietly, like a candle drawing toward its final breath. But the days they spent together were rich with softness. She wrote poetry again, pages of it, folded and left in books for her mother to find later. She taught Adeline how to use the old camera they'd once shared, and together they filled a box with photographs. The dogs in motion, the sun behind the trees, Eli wiping sweat from his brow beside a half-built window frame. And when she felt well enough, Clara read aloud, sometimes from Adeline's old journals, sometimes from her own. Her voice, though raspier now, held warmth. She spoke of things she'd never said, about fear, about leaving, about the ache of time lost and the wonder of finding her way home again. When the leaves turned to amber and the nights sharpened, Clara asked Adeline to sit beside her under the oak tree, just once more. They sat on a bench Charles had carved decades ago, a blanket wrapped around their legs, tea steaming in their hands. The 4 dogs played in the yard below, their golden coats catching the last light like fallen stars. "You know," Clara said softly, "when I first left, I thought I'd never come back because I wasn't strong enough. But it turns out, coming back took more courage." Adeline didn't speak. She only took her daughter's hand and held it in her own. The veins on both hands were pronounced now, one aged by time, the other by illness. But there was no difference in their grip. Weeks later, on a clear autumn morning, Clara passed away in her sleep, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. It was quiet, like the fall of the last leaf on the tree that had watched over them all these years. She left behind a letter, sealed in an envelope addressed simply, "To Mama." Inside, in her looping script, Clara wrote, "Don't stop living when I'm gone. Live louder. Love those dogs the way they love you. Let Eli keep fixing things. And write it all down. Somebody out there needs to know it's never too late to come home." By December, the cabin was filled with motion again. Maple had grown into a tall, lanky whirlwind of energy, always knocking over boots or stealing gloves from the porch. Fern remained shy, but had become the most affectionate of the 4, often placing her head gently on Adeline's lap and sighing like an old soul. Ash was still the thinker, quiet and dignified, always watching, always near. And Bramble, the brave, wild-hearted Bramble, had begun training at the local health clinic with Eli's help. The clinic's lead nurse, Miranda Jacobs, a short, freckled woman in her 50s with a habit of humming lullabies, had noticed Bramble's calm demeanor with nervous patients. Now, twice a week, Adeline rode with Eli into town so Bramble could visit the children's ward and the hospice wing. He brought comfort in silence, the way only animals truly can. Miranda once told Adeline, "That dog has more empathy in his eyes than most people I know." Adeline smiled because she knew it was true. The cabin had changed too. Clara's room upstairs had become a writing nook. Adeline had dusted off her old typewriter, and each morning, while the dogs snoozed by the fire and snow fell like powdered sugar outside the window, she typed. At first, it was just notes, then letters, then stories. She wrote about Charles, about Clara, about the riverbank and the canvas sack, about 4 tiny lives that turned winter into spring again. One of those stories found its way to a small-town journalist named Kelsey Moran, a a fresh-faced reporter in her 20s who ran a column called Heartland Echoes. Kelsey was petite, with wide brown eyes and a voice that warmed quickly with excitement. She visited the cabin one January morning, took notes in a leather-bound journal, and cried 3 times during the interview. The piece she wrote, titled "The Winter They Came," went viral across the state. Letters began to arrive, dozens, then hundreds, from widows in Vermont, from veterans in Arkansas, from a woman in Texas who said she'd been planning to end her life until she read about Edeline and her pups. The mailbox at the foot of the ridge overflowed. Eli built a new one, then a bigger one. One snowy morning, Edeline sat by the fire with a steaming mug of cocoa, wrapped in a flannel robe. The dogs surrounded her in a halo of fur and breath and warmth. Outside the window, Eli hammered the final shingle onto the roof of his tiny house, smiling at her through the frost-speckled glass. She looked down at the page in her lap. If you are reading this, you may feel alone. I once did too. But love has a way of arriving even when we believe it won't. Sometimes it walks on 2 legs, sometimes 4. Sometimes it takes the long way home, through grief and storm and silence. But when it comes, let it in. And when it stays, never stop telling the story. She signed the page, Edeline Wren. And outside, snow kept falling. But in the cabin on the mountain, there was no longer any winter in her heart. Only warmth, only love, only the sound of 4 golden dogs breathing softly around her, their bodies rising and falling in perfect rhythm, as if the forest itself had found a heartbeat again. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with trumpet sounds or shining lights. Sometimes, they come in the quiet padding of 4 little paws, in the form of a forgotten trail rediscovered, or in the last hug between a mother and daughter, once torn apart by time. This story reminds us, God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes, He sends them covered in fur, with eyes full of understanding and hearts full of unconditional love. Perhaps you've lost someone. Perhaps you're sitting alone, wondering if it's too late to begin again. But as Edeline discovered, it is never too late for love, for healing, or for hope. Even the coldest winter can become the beginning of someone else's spring. So today, if you're watching this with tears in your eyes or a warm heart, take a deep breath and remember, God sees you. He hears you. He still writes stories like this, every single day. A small prayer for you watching. May God bless you with companionship when you feel lonely, with comfort when your heart is heavy, and with small, unexpected miracles, like Edeline's dogs, that remind you, you are never truly alone. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced a small miracle in your life? Don't forget to subscribe for more true, heartwarming stories that renew faith, restore hope, and remind us of the beauty in everyday love. And may the Lord bless you and keep you as you carry this story with you into your own.